Thank you for joining us this morning. I hope you guys are excited as I am for this topic. I'm really looking forward to it. So if you don't know me, my name is Claire Vandereyck. I am a volunteer with Preserve Minneapolis. We are really excited for our second Morning Forum of 2017, and as most of you already know, we rebranded this event series from the Breakfast with a Preservationist to Morning Forum, which we feel more aptly describes what we're doing on an every other month basis at these events. So
I thought it was to save money so Bob wouldn't have to buy breakfast for
No, I mean that's what the donation jar's for. But yeah, so today we welcome Stephanie, Will, and Ann, who are going to talk a little bit about being young and a preservationist in Minneapolis and around Minnesota, what that means to them, and how that impacts preservation on a wider scale. So just quick, for those of you who don't know, I think probably everybody here is familiar with Preserve Minneapolis, but just in case you're not, and for those of us watching on Facebook Live today, Preserve Minneapolis is our local Minneapolis-based nonprofit. We're fully volunteer run. We do, in addition to these morning forums, which again we do every other month, we have several other events that we offer. We offer our evening explorations, which happen opposite months of the morning forums. Hope that you join us for those. Next month is Preservation Month, month of May. We've got several events coming up in addition to a evening exploration. We're going to have Insta-meets, movie premieres, lots of really cool things coming up. So if you don't already follow us on Facebook, please do that, and then you can learn all about what we're doing and what we're bringing to you guys to come check out. So with that, I'm going to turn over to the panel to quickly run down the line and introduce themselves, and then Stephanie is going to go ahead and start us.
So I'm Stephanie Rouse. I'm a member of the board of Preserve Minneapolis and chair the Advocacy Committee.
I'm Will O'Keefe. I'm a project manager from Bader Development.
I'm Ann Ketz. I'm currently the real estate program coordinator for the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota.
One quick note I'll give you guys, just not you guys, but everyone here. The mics are for our cameras, so they're not live, but I think you guys can hear everybody fine. So as long as everybody can hear them, we're good.
All right, so I work for the city of Anoka, where I'm an associate planner, and my daily duties, I am the staff liaison to the Planning Commission. I work with project development and building permit review. I also deal with the vacant building registration, code enforcement, and rental licensing. Those last three items you might not think as preservation activities, but they really do tie directly into preservation of our historic building stock. So the vacant building registration, we're requiring property owners to submit a maintenance plan to us and a yearly fee, which encourages them to rehab their buildings and put them back on the market and into use. The rental licensing program, we are in these rental units every 3 years, writing up compliance orders, making sure property owners are maintaining their buildings and up to building code standards. And the last one, code enforcement, can range anywhere from just junk in front of houses to peeling paint, which is something that we require them to keep their buildings up and looking good and in good condition. And just a little bit of background, I've been interested in preservation since I was a kid. I always loved old buildings, and I remember reading a book called Gone Away Lake, where these kids go exploring a swamp and run into a bunch of old mansions, and just listening to them describe how time has changed these buildings and the neglect, what it's done to them, was just fascinating to me. And so I really got interested in preservation, not knowing really how to translate that into a career. I thought architecture was about the only way, so I enrolled in the University of Nebraska Lincoln in their architecture program. Spent 4 years there, and towards the end realized it really just wasn't for me, because I've worked on one preservation project in the entire 4 years. So I think that is an opportunity for young preservationists, is to try and engage youth before they're starting their careers, to show them what preservation is, and that it can be fun and exciting, and it's not just raging battles in the media. So then I switched from undergrad to my graduate program in community and regional planning. I was fortunate enough to be able to intern at the city of Lincoln with a preservation planner, And early on, he told me you have to continually sell the benefits and show the added value that preservation has, especially for his position. It was only partially funded by the city. Remainder was funded by a state historic preservation grant. And that's a stark contrast to Minneapolis here, where we have a number of staff that are preservation oriented and have that experience. I think going along with selling the benefits, we have this argument and kind of debate going on right now between density and preservation, and it's two sides of the coin, whereas I think young preservationists can bring to the table a different perspective, that it's density and preservation, because we oftentimes have developers coming in that just want to wipe clean any historic buildings and build large towers, and then we have preservationists that just want everything to stay the same. But we can do both, and I think we see that in the NICE project that's currently going up. You have the historic buildings that are being saved, but you also get the added density of the apartments going in. And I think it's a good project that shows that you can have both, and it's especially important with population projections rising, and they're projected to rise in cities, and so we're going to see more density in areas where we don't have a lot of land. After college, I went to Lubbock, Texas to work as a planner down there. Being the only one with any preservation experience, I got the task of working with the Heritage Preservation Commission, and it was interesting to see just the differences in cities and even states. Their commission had met once the year prior to me going down there, which is a stark contrast to Minneapolis, where we've got packed agendas every month. I was fortunate enough to be able to help a property owner do a local designation and begin the restoration work of a 6-story office building in the largely vacant downtown. But that's where I realized that local designation really is just for show. There's no added benefit to it. Most incentives, if there are any, are unusable for property owners, which is another opportunity for young preservationists to try and start creating some of these funding mechanisms that can help owners of these historic buildings preserve and restore them. Anoka is currently facing a challenge with one of their property owners in the downtown core. All the buildings were rehabbed in the 90s, except this one. It maintained its stucco facade that was put over the historic brick. Well, now it's starting to spall off and becoming not only a danger, but a blight to the downtown, and the property owner doesn't have the money to reinvest in the building, and the only option that the city can provide is a revolving loan fund. So trying to come up with facade restoration programs or different mechanisms like that that can kind of bridge that funding gap that the property owners are facing is important. Minneapolis is starting to see this. The historic Homewood district that was recently designated, property owners were very against that because it puts restrictions on what they can do, and they may not have the funds in order to restore it meeting those historic district guidelines. So Minneapolis is now looking into different ways that they can try and help fund property owners' maintenance and restoration of their homes if they're within these historic districts. So I see young preservationists being more engaged and involved in the coming years. You go to committee meetings or attend a public meeting and you just see a lot of preservationists that have been in the field for 20 and 30 years. You don't see the young preservationists attending, and I think it's important that we start attending more meetings, providing feedback and input to kind of be the next generation of preservationists coming in. We can start to reframe the issue of saving buildings as battles between different interests to saving buildings as the standards, trying to get developers to think preservation first and then go from there. And I think it's incredibly important that we start sharing our creative and innovative ideas. One of these that was mentioned by Claire in the beginning is our Insta-Meets. It's a partnership with MN Communities, and it draws a large crowd of not standard preservationists. It's a lot of photography people, Instagrammers that come and just want to see these old buildings, but while they come to these events and get a tour around, they also get to hear the preservation story behind these buildings that we have. I think technology is the next wave. We've started with Preserve Minneapolis getting into some of this. We've launched a blog on our website where we post a couple different blogs each month on different preservation issues, or we recap events like the morning forums and provide some pictures of different tours or just interesting buildings that we've seen around town. Instagram to go along with the Insta Meets. We have an active Instagram account, and we like to post, weekly where we at to engage a different audience and make it fun and show that preservation is fun and exciting, and it's not just trying to fight development. And then Facebook Live, which we launched last month with our morning forum, which allows people that may not be able to come physically to our events at 8 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, but still want to see and are interested in what we're talking about. That way they can watch live from the office or catch up, afterwards. I think preservation's come a long way, and I'm thankful to those preservationists that have come before me to get us to this point. But I think now, as young preservationists, it's our turn to pick up the torch and carry forward.
Well, that hit on pretty much everything I wanted to. So as I mentioned before, I'm Will O'Keefe. I work for Bader Development as a project manager. I did not bring my black hat, but I have one somewhere at home. And really, in that, I do a little bit of new construction, or maybe a lot of new construction, and I do a little bit of historic rehab. But I come from the preservation community. And in a lot of ways, I'm kind of an accidental preservationist. I grew up liking history, and I went to college in rural Ohio and studied Middle Eastern history and Islam, and learned to speak Arabic, and moved to Washington, D.C., and found that I had basically no job prospects. And ended up working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And in that capacity, I worked as the administrative assistant for the law department. And no particular interest in law. It just started as a job. It's amazing how quickly a job becomes a passion, and how quickly a passion can become a career. And so in that process, what really got me hooked on preservation and ultimately led me down the path of real estate is that I worked on Charity Hospital in New Orleans and the advocacy campaign around that. And it's one of the oldest hospitals in the country. And after Hurricane Katrina came through and leveled New Orleans, it was a building that had been cleaned up real quick because medical need was so great in the city. And we were talking about bad boy carve-outs in real estate deals, and I would say through some terrible actions by interested parties, they trashed the hospital all over again so that they could get more money from FEMA. And what we did as an organization, as a law department, well, one was sue, but two was really work to show that there were other options available that didn't require LSU and the Veterans Administration to leave Charity Hospital behind. And so we had put together a plan that showed for about 60% of the cost of a brand new hospital complex, they could reuse Charity Hospital. And by all means, you got to go look at a photo of it. It's this insane, huge Art Deco building. And the goal was really to build a 21st century hospital inside the frame of a early 20th century hospital. And that we could provide the medical care that New Orleans needed. And do it within historic buildings, kind of like what Stephanie was saying, that there are ways that we need to reuse these buildings, and cities change and places change, and we need to do right by the character and by the city, and it doesn't always mean building new. And that was where my mind kind of got hooked on real estate, even if I didn't know it at the moment. So when I moved up to Minnesota from DC, I, again, had no job prospects. And the only people I knew were preservationists. And I got involved a little bit at a time, started on the Advocacy Committee at PAM, and ended up as the administrative assistant, and did that for a year, and convinced Bonnie McDonald that really my talents were not suited as an administrative assistant. I'd be much better off as the communications person. And that lasted about a year, and maybe a year and a half, and I convinced Bonnie and then Doug that my talents were much better suited building a real estate program, that North Carolina had it figured out, and that we were going to bring real estate to Minnesota, and that we were going to do these tax credit deals and be a different model for preservation in Minnesota, and a different model nonprofit. And so I worked on building the real estate program at PAM for a couple years, and did a whole bunch of different things in that capacity. We did historic tax credit deals. So I was meeting with developers and bankers and lawyers and looking at different funding models and helping developers, encouraging developers really to use the historic tax credit and helping provide a path to them to get more money out of those tax credits. Which is ultimately what all development comes down to, is can you make the project pencil out? And I also at the same time was, one of my favorite projects I did was working up in Duluth on the Armory. And the Armory is one of those stories that is all too familiar to preservationists. You had a building that, you know, is late 1800s, I think it was built maybe early 1900s, and the city owned it after it had been obviously an armory. And the city of Duluth was using it to store their trucks, their public works trucks. And you can imagine what salt does to concrete over decades. And they had effectively destroyed this beautiful building. And, so they announced that, well, we're going to build a new public works facility and we're going to tear down the armory. And this is an armory that, matters so much to the city of Duluth. It's up on the hill. It overlooks the lake, like most of Duluth, I guess. But, Bob Dylan played there. Bob Dylan saw Chuck Berry there. There's all these stories and all these memories that come with the armory. And a group of advocates got together and said, well, we don't want you to tear this down. And so he said, fine, you guys take it, which is great. The group, kind of got formed, created a nonprofit, and said, all right, we're going to do this. The only issue is they paid $1 for the building and didn't get a penny to help them fund any maintenance of the building. And so the city, of course, probably 6 months after they sold the building for $1, condemned it on the nonprofit. And luckily, it's terrible to say, luckily, the city of Duluth had no money, so they couldn't actually tear down the building on the nonprofit. So it sat condemned for 11 years. And we got brought in, the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota got brought in to help this nonprofit find a solution. And that's what preservation is about. Preservation is about real estate at its heart. And so, we often look at it as an advocacy solution, but it's really a real estate solution. And so we worked with the local group to find a real estate solution. And what that was bringing in a developer who ended up buying the building and an ancillary building next to it, providing space for them to operate their music nonprofit out of in the basement. And the goal is to build affordable housing plus market rate housing next to it. And have on the armory floor, have a grocery store and a restaurant. And, this is how buildings change, how neighborhoods change. Preservation is at the heart of every neighborhood that's changed for the better for decades in cities across the country. So, these are two of those things I always think about as far as how real estate works. And I ended up getting hired to work in real estate development after this. And that came about by meeting with a city council member in St. Louis Park who wanted me to convince a developer not to tear down a potentially historic building. And I ended up making the case why they should be allowed to. And the developer afterwards came up to me and said, well, you're not like any preservationist I've ever met. Do you want a job? And I've been there for 2 years. And, so moving forward, the model in preservation is changing, but but we still need to be advocates. We just need to be advocates with a better understanding of how real estate works and encouraging redevelopment instead of just saying no. And there's a balance to be struck. I'm not a fan of candlelight vigils. I don't think that helps. I'm a fan of getting involved and finding solutions and playing an active role in helping find that solution. I know Claire gave me a list of things, but I feel like I've rambled on for so long, so I'm just going to turn it over.
Thanks, Will. So as I said, I'm Ann Ketz, and I think, the other two panelists have said a lot of the same points again that I was going to say, but we'll just keep repeating ourselves. It's good that we're all on the same page, I guess. So as I said, I currently work for the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota as a real estate coordinator. I took over after Will left, after he helped build the program, and I helped keep it going and continue to build on it. I also currently work for the City of St. Paul part-time in their Heritage Preservation Department, so I'm doing a little bit of nonprofit and a little bit of municipal work. And this is only until Friday is my last day at these two jobs, and then I'm starting on in a week with Urban Homeworks, who's a community development organization in Minneapolis. They focus on small, affordable housing rehabs, including mostly single-family houses and some very small multifamily housing. So I'll be doing real estate project development with them. I'm very excited about that change. Sad to be leaving Pam, but so a little bit of background on sort of my preservation perspective and how I got into preservation. I wouldn't say I was an accidental preservationist, but sort of similar with what Stephanie was saying, that I didn't know that it could be a career. I had always had an interest in history and an interest in old buildings and architecture. I didn't want to be an architect, I didn't want to be a teacher, I didn't want to work in museums, and I didn't think there was anything else that I could do. So when I went to undergrad, I ended up going for a degree in global studies because it still allowed me to study history, people, places, and culture. But I felt that it was a little bit more marketable because we live in a global world, right? Of course, I graduated at during the middle of the recession, so that went nowhere. But fortunately, I was working and had been working for a long time for a construction company. And so that's where I got a lot of my early experience from. I started out working in admin with them, and then working up to safety program management, and then eventually project coordination. And so I worked there for about 7 years, took a few years off after undergrad, and was kind of looking to get back into something that I really cared about, use the experience that I had learned, and what could I do with that? And just started doing research again, and suddenly you can get a master's in preservation, So I'm like, wow, yeah. So I started looking into that, started volunteering with Pam, getting involved in local preservation activities, and then ended up going out to the University of Maryland in College Park for my master's program. Thought I was going to stay out on the East Coast because there's a lot going on out there, right? There's all the federal organizations, but quickly learned that I love Minnesota, and I came back here quickly. So, and soon after found a job with the Preservation Alliance. I, also have a real estate focus. It was probably one of my first days in grad school. My first class was preservation economics, and we had a professor that was a real estate developer that did a lot of historic tax credit projects, and just, basically the intro was like, preservation doesn't work. It's like, that old building you love, it's not going to happen, But then tied it all back to like, how can we make this happen? And really, that's what got me into this. Like, we can love these old buildings as much as we want and admire the architectural features, but if you can't make the numbers work, it can't happen, right? So that's where I've made my focus. But I think, and I've seen a lot of my other peers as well, young preservationists, sort of gravitating towards that as well. But what I like about it is that we're sort of preservationists first and real estate second, or planning second. And so I think we need more of that, more of us preservationists sort of, inching our way into these other fields. But so my sort of general preservation ethos is, I think, reuse above all else is important. So there's a place for historic districts, there's a place for maybe conservation districts, and then there's all the other places that aren't going to ever be designated. And so how do we make sure that those places are also reused and saved? My ultimate goal, I would love to see sort of preservation just be, you know, the general norm, like the expectation that, and it's sort of like that social pressure, right? It's like, just like everyday recycling of everyday materials has become, it's just going to be assumed that we're going to try to figure out how to save these, you know, reuse these buildings. Maybe, you know, it's going to be creatively redesigned so that we can build on top of it and create more density. But it's that greener, sustainable reuse while protecting sort of this human scale development that was built in the, you know, turn of the 20th century, late 19th century, that everyone loves so much. And so I think where we as current young preservationists stand out, and what I really like is that you're really seeing this sort of renaissance of Jane Jacobs, right? And the new urbanism, and that it's not just about individual buildings, it's about the entire community and how that all fits together, and a mix of new and old is important. And one of the things that I think, one of our biggest challenges that I think we have as young preservationists is sort of correcting all of the stereotypes and myths that have been perpetuated over the last several decades about what preservation is and what that means. I think all of us that are in this room or potentially watching this video have an understanding of that. And it's the people that are outside of here that either have had a bad experience with regulations, and so then they equate that with everything that has to do with preservation, or they just have no understanding of it, which I experienced a lot when I was going back to grad school and telling people what I was doing. They had no idea what I was talking about. One guy thought I was doing stork preservation, like storks. So, so I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and that's not an easy thing to do, and that could take still generations to sort of change that mind frame of what preservation is. But I don't, you know, I've heard a lot of arguments to sort of ditch the preservation word and like we'll call it something different, and I don't think that's the answer either. I think we need to embrace that and change what it means, right, in people's minds. And one of the other big things that I think is going to be a challenge for us is suburbs. So that's, you know, and especially as young preservationists, a lot of us live in urban areas, and that's sort of the areas that we care about. What happens when, you know, the suburbs start declining? Are we just going to not care about it? Are we going to, what are we going to do? I don't have an answer for that, but that's, I think, a challenge. And I think lastly, you know, touching on a lot of what Stephanie said again too, some of the things that we really need to keep building on are these funding incentives, incentives for vacant buildings, and you know, more funds for preservation. And lastly, I think more sort of preservation-oriented developers, right? So those of us that are preservation first, real estate second, making it about our favorite old buildings. Yeah.
That was so great. Oh my gosh, that was so interesting. Okay, so I want to open it up to questions. Bob's got a mic. Again, the mic's for the camera, so but just still speak into it. And then if anybody has any questions that they have for these panelists. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Elizabeth Manning. I'm actually a structural engineer and preservationist too, I guess. I was kind of wondering, the last two. I'm sorry, I don't remember your names, but the last two, you mentioned you both work for Pam, and sounds like you're finishing up now. Is it typical that you work for 1 or 2 years? Is that a typical? Because it sounds like you were working 1 or 2 years and moving around, and I was just kind of wondering about that for Pam, and if there's kind of rotating people getting involved in the organization and that sort of thing.
Sure. I would say, you know, I've been there 2 years. I basically had a new opportunity that popped up. I wouldn't say that it's like the norm to be there for only 2 years. You know, we have a few staff people that have been there for 7 or 8. Yeah. So it just depends on the individual. I think is more of the case. You know, I was really well. A lot of what I've been doing at PAM has been on working on these state historic tax credit investment deals and working with a building that we own currently. And I was really looking to just build more on my real estate finance skills so that, you know, eventually, hopefully, be able to do some of this work myself. So that was why I've only been there 2 years. But I don't.
I mean, I was there 5 in the end. You know, across 3 different positions, and it's. I mean, being blunt, real estate's really tough in the nonprofit realm because the for-profit world is a siren's call that is really appealing when it comes to pay and money. I mean, it's a different world, and so that is a challenge for preservation. It's a challenge for every nonprofit that is a for-profit arm, you know, or wing to it. So I would say that was part of it too for me, honestly.
My name is Phil Martin, and I worked for 30 years in a family business that did historical preservation accidentally. We were importers of handbags and needed cheap warehouse space. So cheap for us meant $2 per square foot per year, including heat and electricity, period. No long distance phone calls. That wasn't included, but everything else was. If you're familiar with real estate, that's fairly unusual. But we were in 8 buildings in 80 years, and only once were we above $2 a square foot, and that was the 2 years before we were kicked out of the Loon Cafe location, which we had occupied for 17 years before that, at below $2 a square foot. So how does this relate? The last building we were in was built in 1885. It overlooks the Mississippi River on the north side. Bardwell Robinson. The building had been purchased for about $300,000. It covered a square block, 2 square blocks, including the Bauer Brothers property now. And this building was 5 stories high. The one part that was that I occupied 12,000 square feet of. And we had a downtime around Christmas, and so I had my crew sand the floor. Well, this was the floor had never been vacuumed, and after we vacuumed it, we didn't sand it the expensive way, but we just had one of these rotating things, and trisodium phosphate, the spick and span, and a wet pickup vacuum cleaner, and we found that the floor was wavy maple and bird's eye maple. So when we were through and polished it up, it felt like we were walking on the back of a violin. And the owner of the building kind of had a different view of how they would use this building because what we had found. And so I bring this perspective that a profit-making business who's Norwegian cheap are accidental preservationists. And I could name some other buildings that we almost saw tore down. The place where this across the street, a spaghetti factory. I leased the basement of that for 11 years. And we saw a Bolander construction company come in, and they were going to convert that to parking spaces. But it was too expensive to knock it down because it was built like a brick shithouse. And so we cleaned it up, and we had to have it clean because we were shipping handbags. We can't have them dusty. And so one other thing that's related to this, at Christmas time, I was at my wife's town of Huron, South Dakota, and they had just closed the final retail space in the mall built in the 70s, or about the 70s. It was a Kmart, and the Kmart closed fast, and they just moved out fast. And the reason is that there was a plant that made or that harvested birdseed, sunflower seeds, and they needed a warehouse space. Well, the Kmart was just great because they had you would bring in a 40-foot trailer, and so by Christmas, I took a tour through that space, and it was floor to ceiling, a big wall. A big Kmart, floor to ceiling, double stacked pallets of sunflowers. They had a big sunflower operation that needed a warehouse, and I noticed it because there was water flowing out of the building, and the floor and the door was all open. And so, being a snoop, I walked in. This was the day after Christmas. And the owner of the mall didn't have enough money to heat the place, and so the sprinkler system broke, and they had a flood. And the manager of this thing was sweeping the water down the drain, and asked me to leave because I was taking pictures, and erased the film, and which I left, but I didn't erase the film. I thought that was very interesting, that reuse got done and helped the community, because this processing operation really needed to get efficient warehouse space.
So I think displaying that there's a large number of benefits. It's not just we're saving the old building, it's you're saving the old building that's part of an entire community of fabric of old buildings, new buildings, that it's not demolishing the building and putting all of that debris in a landfill. So it's a sustainability issue as well as an economic issue and a preservation issue. If you come at it from multiple perspectives and show that it's not just saving the building, it's all of these other things. And as you mentioned, tearing down the building for a parking lot was more expensive, so they didn't do it. And so showing that it is usually less expensive to keep the building than to pay all the money to take it down and to dispose of all the materials and then to buy new materials in order to put it up. And typically you don't have buildings lasting as long as these 100 and 150-year-old warehouses that we do now that are being put to their second life.
So I guess the way that I always look at it is I talk to everybody and just say, you're a preservationist. Anna mentioned that, preservation sometimes feels like a bad word, and there's been all these, articles and hand-wringing about whether or not we should even use preservation as a term. And I don't really agree with that either. I think that we all, even if you guys weren't here in this room knowing that you were at a Preserve Minneapolis event, we're all preservationists. The bars that I go to are in old buildings. I like them because there's character. You bought a house that is a late 1800s house because you like that character, because you like that walkability that comes with a neighborhood with an urban fabric. In main streets across the country, people that live in these towns are preservationists. They would never think about it and say that they're a preservationist, but they are. And so the more that we can do to convince people that they're a preservationist, and and have their first thought be, well, can we do this? Because it's not even that the first thing is should we do it, it's can we? And if we're willing to think creatively and we're willing to look at different creative financing, to look at different models, you can reuse old buildings. It's a little harder, and there's a lot more unknowns, and there's a lot more risk, but it can be done, and it should always be, in my opinion, it should be the thing that you're giving your first thought to before you go tear down a nice old building.
Yeah, sort of mirroring what these guys said. I think, you know, like the question in the audience or statement was that you're, you know, an accidental preservationist, and sort of saying what Will is saying, that accidental preservationists are actually preservationists that just didn't know that they were preservationists, right? And so I think some of the toughest conversations that I have in trying to convince people that preservation matters and that we should reuse our old buildings are with sort of like strict urbanists that just want more density, right? At whatever cost. We need to build up and build out. And I think in those arguments, it's about creative redesigns. It's about using what's already there and building on top of it. It's about, you know, how can we create density but save what we already have? And I think, I don't know where it's going with it. Thanks. I think that's, I mean, for the most part, good enough.
One thing that I would add to that too is what I always go back to, and Anne mentioned this earlier when she was talking as well, is the importance of community and the role that our built environment plays in community. And so one of the things that Anne said that I really liked is that it's not just about the individual building, it's about the wider spread community. And we don't have those conversations nearly enough. We don't talk nearly enough about the role that this building plays in the greater spread of this place. You know, like Will said, you know, the bars that we go to, the coffee shops that we go to, these all make up a sense of place that's unique and important and special. Now, if we were to remove those buildings, would that sense of place still be there? I don't think so. I don't think that can be recreated. And so it's when we're talking to people who aren't, you know, natural preservationists or accidental preservationists, maybe that are actively trying to fight against preservation. I think that that's one of those things, the financing, the economics are all arguments for it, often make more sense, but maybe sometimes can be a little more difficult. But again, like what you were saying earlier, sometimes it just naturally happens. Preservation just naturally occurs. And we don't have those conversations enough. And people every day are making the choice to house their businesses in old buildings, and they don't know that they're preservationists. Often, Andrew and I do a lot of events at places that people that own these places and own these businesses that are in these places don't even know what preservation is. They just like this old building. And so that's having that conversation and telling them how they're adding to our preservation story, I feel like is a really important part of the conversation too. So any other questions? Yeah.
My name is Kevin Vasquez, and I work as a structural engineer in the Twin Cities, and I do deal with a lot of historic buildings or existing buildings as well. My question is, well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It's very nice to hear that there are people like you working in this type of projects. But my question is, knowing that you actually have experience in other states, what do you think, or where do you think Minnesota is in terms of the different traits that are required for dealing with this type of projects? And I am talking about architecture. The work obviously start with you guys working in real estate, but architects, engineers, and then the people that actually do the work. Is it something that you see that Minnesota is well placed? Or because obviously we know that something is going to become more expensive to achieve if we need to bring trades from other states or even from farther. I mean, we just know about the state capital where they have to send some pieces far away, even Italians, something like this. What is your perspective in that sense?
I can start. So, I mean, I think one of the things that plagues the industry right now, and this is new construction and preservation, I'll say, is that, and it's what makes historic tax or historic deals even harder, is that labor is so expensive, that materials are so expensive, and that's just, you know, when you're doing a historic project, there's fewer firms to work with, fewer businesses that do this kind of work. And it kind of goes back to that, you know, across the country again, that we don't have craftsmen anymore. People built things. Again, it's an argument for why we shouldn't tear down old buildings. You can't build this building again. It is not possible. It's not possible from a construction standpoint, and the cost, there's no way in hell. And that's a real problem. You know, as far as where Minnesota is placed like most other states, I think. I don't know if we're better or worse when it comes to construction and preservation. The only argument I'd make for us maybe being a little more challenged than other places is when it comes to the number of places that have been put on the National Register in Minnesota. I think that we are woefully lacking here. And that does inhibit development, it inhibits preservation. And I think it is an easily irreparable thing, but I don't know that it's going to change anytime soon.
I guess having been in Lubbock, Texas, it's a big difference being in a city that's kind of island out in the middle of nowhere. If anyone knows where Lubbock, it's the Panhandle down by Amarillo, about 5 hours from Dallas. And so there's not a lot of, you know, specialty trades and people that know how to restore masonry or old wood windows. And so you don't see a lot of preservation happening. It's just easier and cheaper to just go with new, and you might keep the building but put new vinyl windows in it. Whereas here in the Twin Cities, there is an endless amount of seminars to go learn how to restore your old windows that I think Pam actually puts on a lot of them. And there's different tradesmen, especially in the Midwest. You have a lot of specialties and tradition that's been handed down. So I think if you're in a larger metro area, like the Twin Cities, you have more opportunities to preserve these buildings. I mean, it's not always the most economic ways, as you mentioned, but there's more opportunity in cities like this.
Yeah, I would say one of the things I found, you know, going to grad school on the East Coast in Maryland was that it's much more established out there, right? So I think we're a little bit behind in that sense, and that, you know, I had even my brother said this to me when I started grad school. Oh, it makes sense that you're going out there because they have old buildings and we don't really. You know, it's like they're only 100 years old, so they're not that old, kind of a thing. And so I think that kind of translates a little bit into the trades as well, and the professions that are working in these fields, and that we just don't have as many firms as potentially they do on the East Coast because they've been much more entrenched in sort of old buildings for a longer period of time. But that being said, I still think we're sort of in the middle, I think, in terms of other regions in the U.S. Yeah, well, North Middle.
I'd like to make a few comments. In my architectural work in the last 35 years, starting then, it was hard to get contractors and building materials. But move forward to today, and my projects don't have problems finding contractors that have the kind of experience it takes for the particular restoration involved. Second comment, in terms of reuse, the coffee you're drinking today came from Precision Grind, which the coffee house used to be the Agate Theater on Franklin Avenue.
I'm Tom Balcom, and I'm actually a board member of the Preservation Alliance, so I know Ann and Will real well. I graduated from the University of Minnesota too long ago to talk about, but in geography. And one of the mantras in that of my discipline is a sense of place. And I think in preservation, that is really an important concept. And you all talked about it. You didn't use the term, but it's kind of a hard term to define, but it is something very important. And something just struck me. I was driving through my I live in Tangletown, near Minnehaha Creek, and I went by this house yesterday on Minnehaha Creek, and here was this craftsman with a chainsaw working on a sculpture of a tree that had died, maybe an elm. I'm not sure what kind of tree it was. He was almost done by this time. Right out in the front, right by the sidewalk, and he was creating a sculpture, basically, out of wood that'll probably last maybe as long as the house is there. So there's all sorts of different ways to do this, and I don't know. Central place is just really important to me, and I think to preservation because of whether it's a building in a commercial district, it's a house in a neighborhood. You got to think about the wider context and not just the building itself.
All right, guys. Well, we're getting to about a couple minutes to 9 now, and we usually try to wrap up right at 9. So I'm gonna close. I'm gonna put my panelists on the spot here, and they love it when I do this. So what I'd like is to start with Ann and make the way down, and I'd like you guys to say, you know, as young preservationists, as we are working to connect the younger community with preservation. What is one thing that you would say as to why someone who's in high school or just getting into college, why they should pursue a career in preservation, particularly if they're interested in real estate, but why they should focus in preservation?
I would say because the built environment, the buildings around us affect our lives every day, and they really have an impact. I think the character and the aesthetics and the walkability and the sense of place and the community aspect of it all really impact our lives, whether we think about it on a daily basis or not. And so to have an impact on that in your career is very fulfilling and a really important work, I think, for the entire community.
I was hoping you were going to keep going so I could keep thinking. I guess the way that I would talk about it is preservation is a really good way to make your community better. I didn't get any further than that in my brainstorming.
I guess building on what Ann said, yes, it is a part of your everyday life. It's where you go have coffee and go to dinner and go to different events. And so it's not going away, and it's going to be around you. And you can have a great impact, but if we start to lose preservationists, if people aren't getting involved and being engaged, and we're not having that youth come and replace the preservationists that have been here for 20 and 30 years, then people are going to start forgetting about it and start taking the buildings down, and there will be no one there to advocate for it. So I think it's incredibly important that people in high school and just starting their careers in college really take that into consideration.
We have to mention, I think, this morning that good preservation is good ecology. There's a saying you heard that the existing building is the greenest building. And in buildings like this, 75% of its embodied material, you know, the bricks and floors and everything, have been built and are being reused. And that's the value of preservation. It's the best ecology there is.
Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, panelists.